Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program. 7:30, and my military training says you start on time, so here we go. I'm Jim Van Epps, president of the Savannah Council on World Affairs, and our program this evening will be presented by Dr. Kori Schake, senior fellow and director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Our sponsor for this evening is, Kreitz Auto Group, providing excellent service in Savannah and across the coastal empire for over 80 years. We're very grateful to Kreitz for continuing as a platinum sponsor of the Savannah Council. Also, we have this evening Planters Inn, and you're familiar. You know that they're a frequent sponsor of us, of the program, I should say, and they have risen to the platinum level, same level as Kreitz, and we're very appreciative of that. It's in a unique location. It is a boutique hotel, and we are very grateful to Planters Inn for their sponsoring our programs. Also, The Current. And The Current is Georgia's only nonprofit, nonpartisan investigative news organization that provides original, in-depth watchdog journalism affecting coastal Georgia. It currently operates a daily news website filled with exclusive local in-depth news, and their 4 weekly digital newsletters focus on public safety, the environment, education, healthcare, and politics. The Current also uses innovative text-based news feeds to reach underserved communities. So for more, please visit the Current's table in the rear, to your right rear. This evening, we're pleased to have Shannon Gunn with us this evening, and if you have any questions about the Current, it's one of my first reads every morning, please talk to Shannon. We're very pleased to have you with us this evening. So, Dr. Shake's program this evening is entitled Lessons from American Foreign Policy Failures, and she will examine the contemporary legacy of American warfare from Vietnam through Afghanistan to the present day. She'll offer insights into what mistakes policymakers made, what lessons they've learned from our military undertakings, and what they have not. She'll offer her views on how this can inform our military strategy in the new era, we call it, of diplomacy and defense that we now face. Before joining AEI, or the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Schake was the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. She has a distinguished career in government, working at the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the National Security Council. She's taught at Stanford, West Point, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, the National Defense University, and the University of Maryland. She's the author of 5 books and is also the co-editor, along with former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, of a Hoover Institution publication entitled Warriors and Citizens, American Views of Our Military. She's been widely published in policy journals and the popular press. She has a PhD and an MA in government and politics from the University of Maryland, as well as a graduate degree from Maryland, their School of Public Policy. And her BA in International Relations is from Stanford. So, before I go on, I want to go back. These are our fall programs. And please note that the October 17th program will be right here. And then, as we have talked about in the past, our November and going forward programs will be held at the Cultural Georgia Center downtown on Farm Street. So, which is right there. Now, before I go on, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Ambassador Larry Silverman just for a second. Larry?
Thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to see so many people after our summer break. I just wanted to mention that the next program, first of all, you're going to love the presentation by Dr. Schake, but next month's program is going to be a little bit different, and I hope you benefit from it and enjoy it. You know, I think we all benefit from foreign correspondence overseas. not only to get us the news, but to get us the explanation behind the news. And that requires foreign correspondents to be out there in the field for years at a time in their location and regionally, and they've got to develop those deep contacts so they know who to call to get you the more accurate story. And it's unfortunate that many media outlets have had to give up their foreign correspondents based overseas because it's a very expensive proposition. But on October 17th, we're going to bring together a couple of longtime foreign correspondents, now here in Savannah, Meg Coker and Craig Nelson from the New York Times originally and the Wall Street Journal, respectively. And then also someone that I've known over the years during my postings overseas, Robin Wright, who now is at the Wilson Center in Washington, used to write at the New York Times and now for the New Yorker magazine as well. And they will be able to share the insights of their craft. We thought it would be interesting for them to talk to you about how they went about perfecting the craft of being a foreign correspondent. They can talk about current issues and really we'll have more. It'll be more of a panel discussion than one presenter. So I hope you enjoy it as something different from the Council on World Affairs. Thanks.
Thanks, Larry. Okay, so at this point, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kori Schake. Welcome. It's all yours.
So it is such a joy to be here among you. This is my first time in Savannah, and Ambassador Silverman squandered his entire afternoon as my tour guide of your beautiful city, which was a very nice experience. What we are going to do now, though, is gallop through 125 years of American wars, what lessons we learned from them and what lessons we should have learned that we didn't. So most thinking about war starts with the great theorist of warfare, Karl von Clausewitz, who has two important things to say that I hope will frame how you think about. Can you all hear me?
I'm going to turn it up a little bit. Try to.
Okay. Sorry, I do talk softly and carry a big stick. So Clausewitz teaches us two things. First, that in warfare, everything is simple, but the simple is incredibly difficult, right? That it's easy to know what to do. It's actually really hard to do it. And it's also really hard to tell who's going to be good at doing it until they do it, which is why warfare is how states determine outcomes when they are politically important. And the second thing Clausewitz teaches us is that politics is an extension of war is an extension of politics by military means, right? So a lot of times there are two things people think about when they think about the United States at war. The Chinese are better than I thought they were. So two things people think about when they think about the United States at war. The first is, and there's a very famous book on this subject, people think that the American way of war is technology. And that's not actually true. What Americans do, for better and worse, is overwhelm problems with resources, right? Technology is one of the resources we tend to overwhelm problems with, but American strategy is very often ill thought through and very often actually ill executed. And we get saved from our mistakes, for the most part, by just the sheer magnitude of resources that we can bring to a problem. So I want to start with the Spanish-American War in 1898. It is the American war that has the worst general understanding of what caused the war and what the consequences of the war were, right? How many people have read a history book that said yellow journalism was the cause of the Spanish-American War, right? Okay, good. That's not true. it doesn't affect anyone outside of New York City, where the major newspapers are in wide circulation. The second inaccurate theory is, a rising United States. This is like the debutante ball of America's coming of age as a great power, and that we're looking for somebody to beat up on, and Cuba's 90 miles off American shore. How many people have read that version of it? Okay, good. My work here is done. We have stamped out the worst chapter in every book of American history. Because the actual reason that the United States gets tugged into Cuba's war for independence in 1898 is human rights. And it's particularly religious communities in the United States who are so shocked by the behavior of Spain towards Cubans, right? We get the words for concentration camp for the reconcentrado, that Spain takes Cubans off their farms and puts them in camps to try and quell the rebellion for Cuban independence. It's actually the factor in American foreign policy that is most often underestimated is how much civil society, and in particular religious society in the United States, shapes how the United States thinks about and engages in the world. So the Cuban Revolution is brewing. President McKinley tries very hard, offers us as an arbitrator. The Spanish refuse. He offers to buy Cuba so that we can make it independent. Spain refuses. The USS Maine, a U.S. Navy ship, gets sent to Havana Harbor actually to exfiltrate the Americans living in Cuba because things are going very bad very quick between the revolution and the Cuban government. And the ship explodes in the harbor. There's a press frenzy, yellow journalism. There's a press frenzy that Spain sabotage the harbor. To this day, the United States Navy uses as a training exercise the inspection of why the USS Maine exploded, because it was actually ordnance in the Navy's own possession that blew the ship up. So one sweet thing, one thing to be grateful to our military for is what a learning institution they are, that then and now they care about what they get wrong, which is what makes them good. So the USS Maine explodes, newspapers start saying we have to do something. That's when President McKinley offers to buy Cuba from Spain. They refuse. And McKinley gets a declaration of war from both houses of Congress. And the fight of the Spanish-American War, it parallels in some ways the American Civil War in that all the attention is in the Western theater, right? All the attention's on Cuba. What is strategically important about the Spanish-American War is what happens in the Eastern theater. The United States becomes a great power because we become a Pacific power. The United States sinks the Spanish Navy in Havana Harbor in about an hour and a half. A young man by the name of Captain Dewey sinks the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay in about 4 hours with 0 American casualties, and the U.S. gains control of the Philippines, Guam, Samoa, and becomes a major Pacific power. So two kind of lessons from the Spanish-American War. The first is that the Congress, in offering the declaration of war, passes something called the Teller Amendment, which is before we knew we were good at warfare. Congress had the restraint to pass with the declaration of war an insistence that the United States not take Cuba as a colony, because we didn't want to be an imperial power, because for a country constituted like ours, an empire was never going to be a comfortable positioning for us. 6 weeks later, Congress passes the Platt Amendment, which takes possession of Cuba, the Philippines, Samoa. So lesson number one of failures in American foreign policy is the hubris of expanding your war aims once you realize you're winning. The United States retains possession of the Philippines through, 1947? I think somebody who's got a phone, correct me if I've got the year wrong. I think it's through 1947. And the Philippine-American War imposes more casualties on the United States at that time than anything other than the Civil War had. The Philippines fight like hell for their independence, and we really struggle to suppress it and do it in ways that aren't American foreign policy's finest hour. The second lesson from the Spanish-American War is the part about values, right? Because the United States has won the geopolitical lottery. After the conquest of the Indian tribes, when the United States becomes a continental country, we have the two best neighbors in the international order in Canada and Mexico, right? And we've got oceans on the other side. We have an enormous agricultural space. We can not only feed our own country, so we have the land, we have the water. We can not only feed our own country, we can feed lots of other countries too. We have natural sources of energy. We have an immigration pattern that brings us some of the most entrepreneurial people in the world. So the United States doesn't have to go out into the world. And in fact, now in the modern era, the United States, to a degree unparalleled by any other major economy, we are our own market, right? And so we are the last country that will be affected by the collapse of a conducive international order, because we just have a much wider margin of error than almost anybody else is lucky enough to have. What compels the United States, what compels my mom and Americans across ages to care about the rest of the world actually isn't national interest, it's values, right? It's those American religious communities outraged by Spain's behavior in the concentration camps in Cuba. And that pattern repeats itself with increasing frequency as the United States grows more dominant in the international order. So that takes us to World War I, right? Where again, the U.S. is late into Europe's conflagration. None of you are as old as I am, so I can tell you that Woodrow Wilson runs for office in 1916, arguing that he will keep the nation out of Europe's war. And a year later, 10,000 American soldiers a day are landing on the Western Front to commit to that fight. The United States is the banker of the Western countries. We're the armorer of the Western countries, and we are the reserve troops that break the stalemate on the Western Front. Right? So again, it's not strategy that America brings to World War I. It's resources, human, material, and economic. And that breaks open World War I. And when you go back and read the diaries, the letters of people who were American political leaders at the time, it's such a great window into history, because the people living it don't actually know how it turns out. And nobody realizes that the United States is going to emerge supreme from the World War I battle space. Britain never recovers, its economy never recovers. They pay off the loans to the United States. Anybody guess which year they finally paid off World War I? It's this century, my friends. It's this century. Which, by the way, says a nice thing about us as an ally, that we give them 100 years or so to pay off the loan. And And when the U.S. enters the war, we enter the war with specific war aims. It's Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, right? 10 of those are about the nature of the settlement we will demand among the parties to the conflict. But 4 of those 14 points are the projecting into the international system the American domestic political compact, that people have rights and they loan them to governments in limited ways. People are citizens, not subjects. Second, that countries have a right to self-determination, right? This will be the breakup of the empires of our European allies. It gets its start in Wilson's 14 points. And the third really important one of the 14 points for the nature of the international order that the U.S. will create when we are strong enough to dictate the terms of it after World War II is free trade. In particular, this is damaging to the Empire of Great Britain because among the Commonwealth of British colonies and territories, they have an internal market, right? And free trade ends that advantage to Britain of an internal market. So World War I, again, it's the resources. The lesson is that what it takes to get Americans to care about the world actually isn't we want to be the dominant power in the international order, or these people owe us money, or we have an interest in the geostrategy of the European war outcome. It's we want to make the world safe for democracy. That's what gets the United States into World War I. In the intervening period after World War I, right, Americans are we're not comfortable internationalists because, again, we won the geopolitical lottery. We have Canada and Mexico and oceans. And so the League of Nations is a bridge too far for Americans to commit on a standing basis to other countries' freedom. It also matters a lot at this point in time that Woodrow Wilson has already had his stroke and been incapacitated, and he's not a particularly competent politician anymore. He kind of descends into race baiting, arguing that the only people who could oppose the League of Nations are hyphenated Americans, like those Irish Americans or those German Americans, who, for very different reasons, those communities oppose the League of Nations. So in the intervening years, in the run-up to World War II, the United States intervenes in Latin America with military force 17 times. 17 times. Most of those interventions, we persuade ourselves, are to produce better governance and better economic opportunity in those societies. It's, again, like Clausewitz said, right? It's simple to figure out how to do this. It's just super hard to actually make this work, building somebody else's country into a replica of your own when the specific historical, economic, and political conditions that create your own country don't create somebody else's. But one of the interesting lessons that comes out of the interwar years and U.S. involvement in Latin America is the 1935 United States Marine Corps Small Wars Manual. So all of you who thought in 2001 that the United States needed to figure out how to work in somebody else's country where you don't have political control over the country and you need an elegant work the gas pedal and clutch in unison politico-military strategy. Actually, you should go back and read the 1935 United States Marine Corps Manual. And I see Larry Silverman standing in the back. So the most important lesson out of this is let the diplomats tell the military what the right answer is, not vice versa. So the Marine Corps says that winning battles is not the same thing as having a political strategy for success, right? And you need a political strategy at the top of it, dictating your tactical military choices. That's the lesson that perks through from the interventions in Latin America. Degree of difficulty at doing this. No, you have a different answer? Good, I look forward to hearing it in the questions. So that takes us to World War II, which is, again, a war in which American resourcing makes all of the difference, right? That you can turn out an airplane in 45 seconds in American defense industry in 1943, that, when Nimitz chooses to fight the Battle of Midway, right, a very brave choice by the most underrated American military commander in World War II. He's got 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. By the time of the Battle of Guadalcanal, 2 years later, he has 17. And he is not the priority recipient of aircraft carriers. The European theater is the priority for all resourcing in World War II. The United States builds an army in the space of less than 2 years of 10 million soldiers. 10 million soldiers. And that is even with 40% of the draftees declared ineligible. And just to remind you of what a long shadow that the Great Depression of the 1930s and early 1940s imposes, the majority of young Americans who were willing to serve their country in World War II, who were declared unfit for malnutrition. So World War II is, of course, ghastly in magnitude, in conduct, in cost, in human lives, and squandered potential. And the Americans and Allied leaders who build the post-World War II order are people who lived through 2 world wars in their adult lives, right? I mean, the leadership, Nimitz fights in World War I before he commands the Pacific fleets in World War II. Parenthetically, he's from a German-American family from West Texas. During World War I, he writes his letters home in German until his commanding officer says, I think it might be a good idea to switch over to English at this point. So coming out of World War II, the lesson that American policymakers take is that they want a wider margin of error. The world feels dangerous, and American strategy in the 1930s to remove ourselves from the political disputes that caused World War I doesn't feel like a good enough answer to them. They want to build an international order that feels safe in the way the American domestic political order feels safe. So as early as 1942, when Churchill and Roosevelt meet and sign the Atlantic Charter, right? Roosevelt it's actually one of the most bare-knuckled, ruthless diplomatic negotiations an American president has ever foisted on a friendly country. Because at this point, Britain's desperate. They need to be able to give their public a belief that the United States is going to join the war, because there's no way they get to the magnitude of force to be able to retain their sovereignty against the German war effort unless they can get American resources in the war. Roosevelt can't deliver that. The Atlantic Charter is it's before Pearl Harbor. Oh, yeah, it's before Pearl Harbor. Because Roosevelt's desperate to get an American commitment to join the war. And Roosevelt can't give it to him, right? The American people are not there. What Roosevelt gives him is some flowery language that suggests America might join at some point, and that the U.S. and Britain will start doing joint military planning for the eventuality that the U.S. will join the war. What Roosevelt gets in return is a British commitment to self-determination by all peoples. That is going to break up Britain's empire. He gets the end of restricted trade among the British Commonwealth countries, so it's going to break up Britain's economy. So think back to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points: self-determination, sovereignty, and free trade. Franklin Roosevelt actually gets those things from Britain in return for basically nothing. What Britain and the United States and the Allied powers determine after the war is that it's not, the existing system isn't good enough. You need a better insurance policy. And their first choice for producing that insurance policy is creating the United Nations, right? The 5 strongest powers will be a Security Council that have vetoes. You'll have a broader rotating membership, and then you'll have the General Assembly, right? And their hope is that you can work out problems there. And they really think that might work, and then they see the nature of Soviet occupation in the countries that the Soviet Union is controlling as World War II comes to a close. And it's clear that's not going to be good enough for the preservation of peace. Moreover, it's not going to be good enough for the kind of business predictability that Europe desperately needs to rebuild after the wholesale destruction of the continent in World War II. So you get the Marshall Plan as the next step, right? So we've got international cooperation and we've got the Marshall Plan. But then the Soviet Union refuses to participate in the Marshall Plan, and it becomes clear that unless you can make security predictable, even the vast amounts of money being pumped into European industry through the Marshall Plan aren't going to be good enough to revive the economies and prevent the radicalization of populations that you saw in Germany in the 20s and 30s. And so what comes next is a very reluctant United States agreement to create a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? And we make sure that the operative article, Article 5, you may hear a lot about it in recent years, that it does say an attack on one will be considered an attack on all. But then it also says, and we commit to talk to each other and, up to and including the use of military force in helping each other. Right? So we really constrict what we're actually obligated to, and that's required to get the votes in the Senate for ratification. But then you have the Korean War. And it happens so fast, it happens so unexpectedly, it happens after the Secretary of State has said that South Korea is outside the security perimeter of American interests, right? Our interests can't take us in, but then we're so shocked and so worried for South Korea that the United States commits to lead the United Nations force and fight in Korea. The only reason we get a UN Security Council mandate is because the Soviets are dumb enough to leave the room when the vote gets taken. If they had been in the room, you couldn't have had UN action even in the Korean War, which is the most clear-cut case before the invasion of Ukraine of violation of agreed international borders. So the Korean War scares the U.S. enough that it's not going to be good enough just to have a squishy Article 5. You actually need to build a military infrastructure of cooperation among the allies. So that's when Dwight Eisenhower goes to be the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. That's when, I can't remember the first admiral who's the commander of the Atlantic, but they're both Americans. And they're both Americans because Europeans want to make sure we have to join the fight, right? If we're in charge, we'll join the fight, is the guess they take. So the lesson from World War II is we need a better insurance policy. We need a wider margin of error. And the only way those great statesmen can think of to produce that margin of error is commitments by the United States to the security of other countries. They think NATO's not going to be unique. There's going to be a CENTO, what is now the U.S. Central Command of the Middle East. They think that's actually going to be an alliance just like NATO. And there's a CETO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. There's a CENTOS. None of those others work. Because, go back to Clausewitz, we don't have the same depth of political commitment to countries in those regions that we have to Europe in 1947. And so those others collapse and leave only NATO standing. Which takes us to the Vietnam War, which is, it's not the first war the United States loses. The War of 1812 has that distinction. But it's the hardest war we lose, the saddest war, the one that casts the longest shadow into American society. And it casts a shadow in two ways. One is that it makes the United States much humbler about our ability to make other places what we want them to be, what we think they need to be for their own good. And the second thing it does is it creates a very different American military. You end conscription in 1973. President Nixon campaigns on ending conscription. In his case, I think it's not unfair to say his motive was political, right? But it serves the purpose of professionalizing the American military in a way that becomes apparent in the 1991 Gulf War, right? All that spiffiness, all that education, all that training, all that equipment, all those talented people look very different from previous American militaries, right? Ulysses Grant would have been very happy to have that military under his command. The lesson from the 91 war that we learn, or unlearn, we unlearn the humility, right? We think military force can solve political problems. In the wars of the 21st century, we have incredibly complicated strategies with contradictory political objectives that military force cannot achieve, and that we do not put the resources, military, diplomatic, or economic, into play that will achieve our objectives. And so now we are right back where we started in 1898 with the fact that if you are going to have a sophisticated strategy, you have to overwhelm it with resources. And the resources cannot just be military force. Because as no less a source than Edmund Burke said in 1776, the use of force alone is but temporary. It may subdue for a moment, but it does not remove the necessity of subduing again. And a country is not to be governed that must perennially be conquered. And it's so poignant that it's us he was talking about. He was trying to tell the British government to take a different approach to the rebellious American colonies, one that would pull them by magnetism into Britain rather than fuel by violence their objection to being British citizens. Okay, I galloped through those last two because I realize I want to leave time for a conversation. So I'm happy to answer questions. please give them to me. Objections, what do you know better than I do? What do you want to know that I didn't talk about? Let me hear from you. I didn't say one thing you don't agree with. That cannot be true. It's statistically improbable. Yes, you.
I'm going to bring around the microphone to everybody, so just raise your hand, just so that everybody hears and we can hear for purposes of the recording.
We stand up?
And please introduce yourselves to me.
Okay, hey, I'm Jorge. I'm a student at Armstrong right now.
Outstanding.
Yeah. So it might sound nice to say that American interventionism is based on our values, our commitment to democracy. But when you contrast that with the real economic costs suffered by people in Latin American countries as a result of American regime change, is that values-based intervention really worth it?
That is a fabulous challenge, and I'm really glad you offered it. So, not always is the answer. But remember, for example, that the Monroe Doctrine was celebrated by the countries of Latin America because they viewed us as their protectors against countries from continental Europe who were even more predatory than we were. I think the worst mistakes are the mistakes from about 1900 to about 1935 in the American interventions in Latin America, and I hope I conveyed that when I was galloping through, because I think you're right. But one other thing to remember, which is that when we do it right, we don't always do it right, and we do it wrong in a number of ways. But think, for example, of the Koreas. In 1950, they're the exact same country, right? And after North Korea invades South Korea and the United States commits first to a military dictatorship in South Korea that can win the war, and then to gradual democratization in South Korea. Today, per capita GDP in South Korea is $34,000, 30 times the per capita GDP in North Korea. And that's even before you account for the freedom that South Koreans experience that the North don't. So I take your point. We get it wrong a fair amount, and we especially get it wrong with our closest neighbors. But we don't always get it wrong. And when we get it right, it actually does defend human dignity, expanding economic opportunity, and making the world a freer and safer place.
Throughout your talk, you've mentioned our support for self-determination and supporting American values and trying to export those to other countries. But when exactly did that begin? Certainly the Mexican-American War had nothing to do with good values.
True.
You mentioned the Platt Amendment, which is counter to our behavior as a result of the Platt Amendment, was counter to everything conceivable. Yes, in the Philippines, we lost a lot of soldiers, but we murdered hundreds of thousands of Filipinos who were simply trying to go for independence. So what was the philosophy up until Wilson?
So it's a great question. I would encourage you to go read Theodore Roosevelt's 1901 address to Congress. It's what they used to call the State of the Union address. And the original sin, as you rightly point out, is the Platt Amendment. And once they have a hold on the Philippines, once we have a hold on the Philippines, they don't know how to let it go without it becoming prey to Germany or to Russia. And it's actually really sad to read Roosevelt try and explain away the very good critique you just raised. The only thing I will say in defense of American power in the imperial age is that as we grow stronger, we grow truer to our values. And that is not true of any other dominant power in the international order in history. The arc of dominance by states in the international order is that as they get more powerful, they become more ruthless, and we actually become less. And I think that's not nothing.
Sort of following up on that thesis, you made a compelling case about our view of the world, and we're sort of altruistic. I'm remindful of after the U.S., of the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. had the most dominant military power in the history of the world. And the French seemed to oppose us, and I think their impression was if the French had that much power, they would use it to conquer others. They didn't believe the U.S. altruism. So I'm really asking you, so does our view of ourselves comport with Western European views of the world?
So the British are fond of saying that their role in the post-World War II order is to be the Athens to America's Rome, right? They're the smart ones, the sophisticates, and we're the dumb, strong, clumsy ones. In fact, Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, writes that the United States is like a large, friendly dog in a very small room. It wants so much to please you, it starts wagging its tail and knocks all the furniture over. And it is certainly true that the French believed they would use American power to much better effect than America uses American power. But that's why people trust us to be in charge and don't want the French to be in charge, right? Because we can be shamed into better behavior about the use of our power by our friends. The other thing about the transatlantic relationship, I think the best description of Americans ever given was given by the British historian Bertha Ann Reuter in 1923. And she writes, Americans are a people so extreme in politics or religion or both that they couldn't live in peace where they came from. And I love that description of us, not only because it feels true, but because it captures the risk tolerance of American society. And I've worked on European security issues since 1990. And the most striking difference between Europe and the United States, to me, is the risk tolerance of Americans, right? That we don't have gun control, even though we obviously have school shootings, that we have Chapter 11 bankruptcy. I know Silicon Valley venture capitalists who won't loan money to somebody who hasn't run a business bankrupt, because you don't know their judgment until you've seen them on a sinking ship. The Americans wait to see what a harm is before we move to regulate it. Europeans regulate in advance of potential harm. I think that's the cultural difference across the Atlantic, and it leads us to have very different policy approaches very often. I mean, think about the way Europe is moving to regulate American tech companies, while we are watching the Wild West on Twitter and election interference, and we're still thinking about whether this is a problem we need to solve.
Even
Right?
the EU.
Say again?
Even the European Parliament came up with a law on artificial intelligence, and they don't agree on anything.
But it's also the reason the top 10 tech companies in the world are American tech companies and not Europeans. Risk tolerance really matters. It's what creates the go-go dynamism of not just American economy, but the American society.
I have a question over here.
The U.S. Constitution.
Well, there's that too. I'm in favor of it.
Kori?
You didn't get a chance to talk much about the last 25 years, but would you if I characterized us as war with radical Islam and battles are just taking place in a different format, would you disagree with that?
think it's our only problem. I certainly think it is a problem. I would describe it slightly differently, which is the challenge of modernity for Islam. And you can see it being successfully navigated, for example, in India, the world's largest Muslim country, Indonesia, the world's second largest Muslim country. You see it being navigated violently in lots of other places. It is a major strain. What I noticed, so I went to work in the Bush White House after September 11th, 2001, because I'm what passes for an expert on innovation. Why are some militaries successful when technology changes, and why can others not figure it out? And what I noticed among the leadership of the Bush administration was how scared everybody was. They didn't understand the dimensions of this problem. They didn't understand, and of course it was new. I don't say it as criticism, I say it as analysis, that it took probably 4 years before the intelligence community, the military community, and the policy community understood enough about the violence emanating from failed Islam adaptation to modernity before we realized the magnitude of that problem. But I would suggest to you it's not even our biggest problem at the moment.
Thank you, Kori, for your...
The convergence of our adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, who believe they can be more prominent, more successful, more important in an international order that isn't organized the way we have organized it, and are looking to change that order. Yes?
Thank you, Kori, for all your insight. This question is kind of mainly geared towards the Iron Curtain, how specifically with regard to NATO expansion, are we holding up our end of the bargain? And B, is Russia not holding up their end of the bargain, causing us to do what we're doing, and specifically with Ukraine?
I love that question. The answer is no, we are not holding up our end of the bargain, and yes, the Russians are the reason everybody's rushing into NATO. So our end of the bargain, we signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1995, committing ourselves, as the Russians and British also committed themselves, to the security and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And from 2014 to now, we are in violation of that commitment. So we bear some culpability. But of course, the Russians are the reason there's a war in Ukraine right now, not us. So NATO expansion didn't make Russia this way. I worked in General Powell's staff from 1990 to 1995, and I did a lot of the original outreach to the Russians in military contexts. And I have to say I was opposed to NATO expansion in the early 1990s because I, like George Kennan, thought that the road to Europe's security passed through Moscow. And it took about 4 years of watching the Russians refuse to be a normal European country. They just, maybe they had fallen too far too fast. Maybe it was always a Russian motivation. But we tried so hard to help them be a cooperative, prosperous European country, and that's just not what they want to be. And they are a threat, not just continuing threat to Ukraine, but the argument that Russia has made that Ukraine isn't a nation, it doesn't deserve self-determination, it doesn't deserve the right to chart its own course. they will make that same argument about the former Soviet states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and those three countries don't have the strategic depth to absorb a Russian attack and fight on in the way Ukrainians have fought on. So, yeah, it's a serious, dangerous time, and we've let our friends down.
Which is my question. What would be the long-term consequences of our withdrawal of aid to Ukraine?
They will lose. I don't think it's any, I don't mean to trivialize the question, it's a very important one, but Ukraine is fundamentally dependent on weaponry from the West and on budget support to keep their government running. And unless we continue to support them, they will be bled dry. If you look at the two militaries, right? Russia's a much bigger country. They are both being bled dry right now, right? So we are in a race of attrition. Who is going to run out of soldiers faster, Russia or Ukraine? And the Ukrainian military is incredibly adaptable, right? Like teenage kids coming up with phone apps to tell the government where Russian troops are going and assisting in the targeting. That's fabulous. But they can't scale. They don't have the experience and they don't have the training in their military leadership to be able to perk those kinds of innovations throughout their forces. So their performance is incredibly uneven. What they did with the invasion of a couple of months ago of Russian territory, so we will not permit the Ukrainians to fire long-range American weapons into Russian territory. That means the Russians can come right up to the edge of their own territory and target deep into Ukraine, which is what the Russians are doing. And the reason we won't is because we worry that Russia, if that happens, Russia will consider us a party to the war and will either attack a NATO country, drawing us directly into the war, escalate the damage they're doing in Ukraine, a nuclear strike on Kyiv, or attack the United States directly. And those are not unreasonable concerns, but I think the administration has overcompensated on that because the Russians have had a number of red lines that all of us in the West have crossed. And the Russians are being fought to a stalemate by an army nowhere as good as almost every NATO army. And so I think we should have more confidence that the Russians won't escalate because they're smart enough to know that they will lose. Even if they just bring Poland into the fight and not us, they lose this war.
Switching to theater a minute, Iran going nuclear. Can they, should they? Should we get involved or assist Israel? And secondly, the dollar being replaced by the BRICS.
So I wouldn't worry either about the BRICS or the dollar ceasing to be the holding currency of the international order, because the order is extraordinarily sticky. 60% of global transactions occur in dollars, and the ones that have shifted to using the renminbi are because those countries don't have dollars, right? So the Saudis are behaving as the Saudis typically behave, by which I mean to say badly. But almost everybody else who is trying to do business clearances in renminbi, it's because the dollar is too expensive for them to be having dollar holdings. So that's a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness of the dollar. But the other thing is, the reason people hold dollars isn't because they like the United States. It's because the American economy consistently grows at 3 to 5% a year, year on year over time. So it's a stable holding currency. It holds it and increases its value. Okay, but what are the alternatives?
That's it.
Right? Like, it's a relative index. It's not an absolute index. Right? Like, yes, we're bad, but everything else is worse. And that's why the system is so sticky.
And they're buying gold,
And,
as we are.
and I would just add that, when you invest in dollars, you have a stake in dollars. And they don't want bad things to happen to the American economy, which is at the moment doing better than most other economies around the world. And it's strictly out of self-interest that I think there were more predictions of the decline of the use of dollar than the actual fact.
And on the BRICS, the countries in the Brazil, India, Russia, China, and South Africa, the odds of them having a common currency that is advantageous to the very different economies of those countries is deeply unlikely. Also, India is closer to playing on our team than to playing on that team. And the country that's driving them into cooperation with the United States is China, a member of the BRICS. So I don't think we need to worry about the BRICS becoming a big, bristling foreign policy alliance that we have to worry about. India is going to solve that problem for us.
I think we'd be remiss in letting you out of here without some pointed comments about what's going on in the Middle East right now, particularly around Hezbollah. And I thought this question was going to be about Iran, but in any case, yeah. Can you say something? If you want to fit it in
Sure.
the context of tonight's topic, that's fine, but I'm just curious
Sure.
what your take is on
Yeah.
where we're going, two-state solution. What's your...
So I think it's bad, and it's going to stay bad for a long time, because the only solution in which there's genuine peace is a two-state solution where Palestinians denounce Hezbollah, Hamas, Iranian influence, and the use of violence to either achieve political aims or to gain retribution. And we are nowhere near that. And I don't think other countries are going to tolerate Israel depopulating Gaza of Palestinians. So this is going to go on for a really long time, and it's going to be really bad. The other thing I would say is that urban warfare is really hard. It's really destructive. Nobody's good at it. We're not good at it. The Israelis aren't good at it. And we and the Israelis are better at it than most others. This is what war among a civilian population looks like. In my judgment, it's likely to look like this for a while. What the Israelis look to me trying to do now is they're trying moonshots, right? Like the pager attacks, or like the assassination in Tehran. I should back up and say, I wrote a little book in the late 1990s about how a nuclear-armed Iran would affect American interests in the Middle East. And one of the Iranians I interviewed told me that Israel isn't really worried about the Iranian nuclear program, because if they were, Iranian scientists would be dying in mysterious car accidents. And 2 years later, Iranian scientists started dying in mysterious car accidents. What the Israelis are trying to do with these moonshots is reestablish deterrence after they failed on October 7th. I mean, the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel on October 7th of last year was such a colossal intelligence, military, and governmental failure by the Israeli establishment that they are trying to remind all of their enemies of the many things they're good at. So I think we're likely to see more of those kinds of moonshots like the pager attack that was so eye-poppingly interesting in the last couple of days. But I don't sense Palestinians are anywhere near repudiation of Hamas. And I think the war in Gaza is not likely to advance their willingness to repudiate Hamas. So this goes on until somebody's exhausted enough to give up their fundamental political objectives, because that's how war works.
Kori, we got 2 more questions for you, and then we'll have to close it.
That's a great talk tonight. Thank you. Do you see the United Nations serving any kind of a adult in the room with all the things that are going on around the world? You've got the Russia sitting on the Security Council, and they're the biggest threat to security right now. Or do you see the United Nations kind of going the way of the League of Nations or something like that?
No, I don't see the UN going away, and I think it serves some really important purposes. None of those purposes are security, though. What the United Nations is really good for is the most powerful states having to make the case for what they are doing in the world to the less powerful states, right? It really matters to show up and explain ourselves, why we are doing what we are doing, why we are ignoring what we are ignoring. That's valuable. If you go back and read President Eisenhower's UN General Assembly speeches, the UN works well when the U.S. comes up with useful things for it to do that it knows how to do. The United Nations is great at stabilizing a peace once parties to a conflict have agreed to it, right? The UN force in the Sinai between Israel and Egypt has been an enormous success, where an incident could have re-sparked war between Israel and Egypt, and having the buffer, the parties being committed to a peace, and a buffer that kept incidents from becoming the start of wars. It was really good at that. The UN's really good at global health, right? Diphtheria drops, vaccinations, things like that. That's really good. It helps human flourishing. What the UN's not good at is what it calls Chapter 7, which is security. And by the way, it's never been good at it, right? It's where you've had a stalemate in the UN Security Council almost forever, right? They had nothing to say about the Soviet blockade of Berlin in 1949. They had nothing to say about the invasion of Czechoslovakia. That's not what it's good at, and it's not ever going to be good at it until we get to that great day where the American aspirations for security and prosperity become universal. But until then, we're going to be arguing in the UN Security Council. But what it does is make all of us have to make our case and try and persuade other countries in the world to support us. And nobody benefits from international support more than the United States does, because our strategy is always about playing team sports, because that's how we get to the magnitude of cooperation that it takes. For example, China has 370 ships in its Navy. The United States has 291 ships in our Navy, right? We are going to need the help of our friends and allies if we are actually going to have to fight China over anything, Taiwan or anything else. So we actually need a place where we make our case to the world and try and persuade countries to support us. And in the early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, it really mattered that Kenya stood up for the sovereignty of Ukraine, and you saw an international movement around the values that we and the Ukrainians were advocating Russia was in violation of. So that's what it's good at. And it's valuable. It's just not the same as security.
Come back to the Middle East for a second with Iran. They should talk about, yes, I agree with you, there was a colossal failure with Gaza, October 7th, Hamas massacre. Hezbollah joined in because they wanted to aid the Hamas in their fight against Israel. But all of this comes back to Iran. And as intractable as you might think it is, or people think it is, if you don't go after the head of the snake, which is Iran, Tehran, nothing will happen. So what's your thoughts about that?
So I don't agree with you that nothing will happen. I agree with you that Iran is the cause of the malevolence, right? The tentacles of terrorist organizations, the Houthi, Hezbollah, Hamas, that they have created a network, and that network is increasingly cooperating. Not just Hezbollah. I would argue Hezbollah joined in not just to help Hamas, but because they were getting left behind in the great terrorist sweepstakes. But now the Houthi have closed off access to the Suez Canal. Something like 80% of Egypt's GDP comes from charges on the Suez Canal, and that's evaporated. So Egypt now begins to totter also as a result of Iran's malevolence. And I also agree with you that when the United States withdraws from trying to help our friends, that bad stuff happens, right? Abandoning the Middle East is what you see happening in the Middle East now is a reflection of the last 3 American presidents wanting to desperately to get out of Dodge City and leave the Middle East to its own problems. But problems get worse if we don't try to help. The only place I disagree with you, I do think Iran's the problem. I do think at some point we could have to use military force against Iran. But I don't think that's the only solution. And I think one of the best things the Trump administration did was negotiate the Abraham Accords, because the politics had changed between the Gulf states and Israel. Everybody in the region is now, other than the hapless government of Lebanon, is now so worried about Iran that they are willing to cooperate, and even in many cases overtly cooperate with Israel. I mean, it was so striking that when Iran launched its big, colossal 356 missile and drone attack on Israel, that one Middle Eastern country friendly to us, Iran had briefed on it, so they shared the intelligence with us. So we knew in advance to be able to help organize the countries in the region. The Gulf states directly participated in the protection of Israel. Jordanian fighter pilots were shooting down stuff. Egypt was involved. France was involved. And what that demonstrated to Iran was the value of the U.S. playing team sports, because nobody wants to deal with Iran alone. Even we don't want to deal with Iran alone. But tightening a noose around Iran, if you have the time to do it, and right now we appear to have the time to do it, we may not always. You ready for another war in the Middle East?
I think we could do significant damage to Tehran from the air, hit their oil facilities, hit their nuclear facilities. The Arab world, the Sunni Arab world would be thrilled. Our allies would see that we're standing up for something. So I think that's the solution, yeah. Unilateral American action, no boots on the ground.
So if you think you are going to do substantial damage to the Iranian nuclear facilities, 2 things to be concerned about. One is that's probably a 3-month air campaign. That's not a strike. That's a sustained air operation, which means you need 4 months the overt cooperation of the countries in the region, many of whom aren't going to give it to us. And the second thing is a whole bunch of Iran's nuclear facilities are buried under religious sites. So you then drive up the jihadist problem if the U.S. all by itself goes and takes out that program. So, in extremis, I do think we would be so endangered by a nuclear-armed Iran that in extremis I would support that policy. But I think while you have time, it's so much better to get the countries who are going to be more threatened than we are by the Iranian nuclear program to the front of the policy and bearing the majority of the burden of the politics, the economics, and the security of tightening a noose around Iran. My friends, thank you so much for this smart conversation.
Thank you. Kori, thank you so much. You started off with a walk through history, and we just took off from there, and I will tell you there are more than a couple handsful of things to think about as a result of your presentation. So thank you, everybody. Be safe going home tonight. If you wouldn't mind, and you have time, grab a chair and just walk it over that way so those of us who are going to put it all away makes it easier. Thank you. Thank you. See you next month right here, October 17th.